beautiful Kayla Crane, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and owner of the South Denver Therapy. She's located in Colorado. To have her on today, talk all things emotional and relationship, which I know a lot of you have been going through, and a lot of you would love some tips. So, Kayla, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. So I'm super curious, like, how did you get into this area of work? It's quite like a unique place to want to be invested in.
Yeah, so I had a pretty severe eating disorder for about 15 years of my life. And then I went and got treatment for it. And I had a lot of therapy during that. I went to a residential treatment center. And so that's like 8 hours a day of therapy. In that time, I had some amazing transformational therapeutic experiences and some not so great also. And so I thought, like it made such an impact on my life. I thought I was really motivated to go back to school and kind of get trained in it. And I thought I've kind of got an idea of what seems like the right thing to do and not the right thing. I never thought I would work with couples. It was always so intimidating to me. I wanted to just work with individuals, maybe children. And then I was working at a practice and I was given a couple and they said, here you go, you've got work with this couple. And I was so overwhelmed and, intimidated and scared. And I turned out to absolutely love it. My very first couple, I just fell in love with it. And then from then on, I just kind of redirected. And when I got trained in my favorite couples modality, and it's just gone on from there.
Wow, that firstly, I can relate around the eating disorder piece as well. Like overcoming something, 15 years is huge. Yeah, and how brave of you to like fully confidently say that you're out of the other side. Because I know some people say it kind of stays with them for life. Yeah, and I had mine for 22 years, so similar time. So I can really relate to like the challenges because every day we have food. It's not like alcohol or drugs. Not that that's any less form of an addiction than this. So yeah, wow, you almost like basically like guided into doing what you're doing now, just not in the nicest way.
Yeah, and you're totally right. I used to say the same thing, right? With alcohol and drugs, another addiction, right? You can just take that off the table, right? You can go, it's a challenge, but you can go the rest of your life without alcohol or whatever, but you can't with food. And so it's this very tricky way of learning how to just moderate, which a lot of people that struggle with addiction to alcohol or drugs they'll never be able to moderate. Some can, but some can. And we're kind of forced to do that.
Yeah. And I think also like it brings up other people's perceptions around like food and eating when you have one as well, because it's often like come from other influences externally, whether that's family or friends. So it's like a whole triggered sandwich, I guess, where everyone's kind of keeping an eye. So you got thrown into this family, this relationship dynamic. I can only imagine how intimidating that is, because when I interview couples, I find that intimidating. So I cannot imagine like what was going through your mind on that first time where you were like, okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking, please don't fight, because what do I do if you guys start fighting? How do I stop that? Like that was always my biggest fears. What happens if the conflict starts in the session? Like how do I navigate that? Fortunately they didn't, but since then it's been a long time, and so I have seen that, but I've learned how to kind of navigate that. And what I noticed is with individual therapy, sometimes there's kind of like lulls, like people, like you don't, people won't be talking or responding, and you've kind of got to pull it out of them. But with the couples, it's kind of always moving. And so I really liked that. It's just kind of going. And fortunately, it was a great couple, and they came to me to decide whether they would get married or not, which I felt like, oh gosh, there's a lot of pressure there. And then I think about 2 years after I met with them, I got a card telling me we just got married. And so it was like so touching. And I thought, well, this is why I went into it, you know?
Wow. And do you find it easy to switch off from this as well, like on the weekends and after hours? Because it's a very intense level of work that you do.
Yeah, you know, I also work with trauma, and so that can be a little bit hard to kind of turn off. So that it's always recommended that as therapists do our own therapy, our own self-care. It's especially important. Um, and then, you know, my husband would say that maybe I don't turn it off enough. He will say, don't be, you know, your therapist with me. But it just comes natural, right? Like when we're in conflict, I'm like, hey, I know how to handle this, but he doesn't appreciate that.
Oh my gosh. Other people do though, just not you.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Wow. And so do you find couples come to you when they're in like a state of they need help or they come to you for like maintenance? Because nowadays we're hearing more and more around people that actually just have a couples therapist in general, like just to like keep the emotions going, have like a mediator involved, or do you find people come to you and they're like, oh, Kayla, shit, we need help?
I would say it's more the latter, definitely. You get
Mhm.
people in crisis. There's definitely you know, couples that come for either premarital or just kind of like preventative, like you said, maintenance. And they just come to keep keep things going the way they are, or just kind of increase that communication, because it doesn't come natural, right? Communication, when you first begin a relationship, there's that honeymoon phase. And so everything is so easy. And then when that kind of dies down and like real life kicks in, it doesn't come so naturally. Communication is actually a skill that needs to really be developed. And so sometimes people recognize that and say, let's just kind of get ahead of this. But I would say more often than not, they've come in crisis, and a lot of times it's like their last step, right? They've tried a lot of things on their own, and then it's really uncomfortable coming to couples therapy, you know. It's hard enough to do individual therapy to get one person you know, interested in coming in and being vulnerable with a stranger, but to get two people on board, you know, that's even harder. And so a lot of times it's kind of like their last shot. They'll say it's this, or we're going to kind of break up. So there's a balance, but I always obviously recommend to come in ahead of time. But a lot of times they do come in at that final crisis point, and then usually we'll get them back on track, and then they'll just kind of contact me as needed, kind of for like a little refresher, and they'll say, oh, you know, we've got a little conflict going on, can we pop in you know, every couple of months or so.
And do you find then that you have couples that come in that you think you can see that they're either gonna go the way of sticking together or guys call it quits kind of situation?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I've learned, you know, at the beginning I would think, oh, there's no way we're gonna repair this, right? Like this is a tough one. And that's been wrong very often. I mean, couples therapy it really does work, I would say, more often than not. And so I've learned that even, you know, my toughest cases sometimes have made it through. I can just like what I would say my very toughest case I've ever had. And I remember the very first session, I was thinking, oh God, like there's no way. And, you know, they're one of the ones that now call me for like those, you know, like refreshers or tune-ups every, you know, 4 or 5 months if something goes on, but they're so happy. And so it's pretty unpredictable, but I would say more often than not, if they're coming, they're at least invested, you know, they're ahead, right? And so that's something to really build on. And I really do kind of highlight that in our sessions, like, why are you here, what are you doing this for, you know? And that really helps keep things into perspective. And so when it does get really heated and the conflict shows up in the session, sometimes that's what I'll do, like, hey, tell me why you're here again. And then that'll kind of pull them back.
And do you find that it's typically, I'm assuming this is like a male and female relationship, but do you typically find it's like the female or the male that like initiates that we go to couples therapy, or is it quite like a mixed bag depending on circumstances?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's a pretty mixed bag.
Mhm.
However, once we're in there, it's definitely more of a challenge, generally speaking, for the men to be vulnerable, which is you can't rebuild something. You can't really completely connect without the vulnerability. And just in our society, men aren't really raised to be vulnerable. So even if they do initiate because they're saying, oh my gosh, our relationships, headed for the end, they'll come in, but then they're the ones that have the bigger struggle with it. But we get them there.
Yeah, it's so brave. Like it's such a really like intimidating thing. And do you still find that there's like a taboo around it as well, that people are still quite nervous to admit that they come and see you and things like that?
Yeah, somewhat. I don't think as much as before,
Mhm.
years ago, but still, some people will, kind of discuss a little bit like, oh, none of our friends know that we're doing this. But I would say that's not super common. But at the same time, I don't hear people kind of like shouting it from the rooftops either, generally speaking, sometimes, but not all the time.
I find that when I'm in therapy, sometimes I can realize that some of my friends are the same therapist just from like things of describing, but until one of them's like, I see the same person, no one like.
Yeah.
So I can imagine you probably have like similar couples in the environment that probably all see you. Um, and what are like the common like situations that people come to you for, like common challenges?
Well, like I've been saying, communication,
Mm,
conflict resolution, that's a big one. Definitely repairing trust, as a result of mainly infidelity or some kind of
mhm,
betrayal trauma.
mhm,
And just kind of general connection. There, like I said, that like the communication doesn't come natural, and definitely the vulnerability doesn't come natural. And if you're not vulnerable, you're kind of going to hit a wall. And so they'll say, we're just not connecting. We don't know what it is. And that's usually what we've got to, get to, is that vulnerability piece.
And why do you think? Because we use the word vulnerable like everywhere on social media. You see it just kind of like thrown around in podcasts and stuff. Like, why do you think is that people still don't? They find that really scary, really scary. No matter how long you've been with someone, it's still like, oh, can I do this? Why do you think that is?
Yeah. It is so scary. It's really, you're giving somebody an opportunity to hurt you when you're
Yeah,
vulnerable,
yeah.
and so that's why it's important you're not to not just be vulnerable with anyone. You choose people that you trust and that are safe to be vulnerable with. But it is really scary to say, you hurt me. You hurt my feelings. That can be a really scary thing to say. It's a lot easier to just get angry at them,
Mm.
because anger, it's usually masking some kind of vulnerable feeling. But it is really intimidating, I think, for even for me. Sometimes I have to kind of push myself to do that.
And then I guess like it's being extra vulnerable, coming to you and then admitting or sharing these things. Like, how do you kind of create a safe space, I guess, for people to feel comfortable that they can open up because they're sharing in front of their partner and also you, which is super intimidating.
Yeah, and no, it is. Definitely, we ease our way into it. I always give every client couple the opportunity to pass on any question, like I never push them in any way, or if I do seem to be doing that, I always ask for them to kind of point that out. I always respect if someone says, I'm not there yet. I'm not ready to open up in that way. And we just kind of slow it down, and I'll model it. I self-disclose a little bit more than a lot of therapists, I think, in my experience as a client. And I think that does help. I've had some people say, like that really made me, feel a lot more comfortable knowing you a little bit more. And so I think it makes me not feel like such a stranger. I've had my own experiences where I'm working with a therapist for a year and I don't even know anything about them, which, that's okay. Everyone has their own style. But it doesn't connect with me as much. And so that's kind of how I work. And it does seem to, for the most part, increase comfortability with clients.
That's such a good point about not knowing a therapist, anything about a therapist.
Yeah.
And you almost sometimes don't feel you can ask, but you feel like you want to, because as humans, we're like, what about you? Like, that's kind of our thing. And you feel like when you ask, you don't get anything. So I love that. I think that's such a good way of doing things. And have you seen, like, since your time of working in this, have you seen like a shift of like, you've mentioned communication's a huge one. Have you seen like a shift in like differences that people have come to you for? Like, or has it consistently been like lack of communication, infidelity, trust?
Yeah, I think it's for the most part the same, the big things, but then I get more referrals after, working with it, like for infidelity, because I've, that's what I've maybe been successful at with a particular client. And so I think with someone who's experienced that, they're more likely to, if they have a close friend experiencing it, like this helped, right? And so I do notice that with like as far as referrals, but just generally speaking, people that are just kind of reaching out found me through like reviews or Google search. I think it is just kind of that mix ag of communication, connection, trust, and conflict resolution.
And so, like, I know we talk about the 7 year itch, when people get to that 7 year mark. What advice do you give to people that want to rekindle their romance? They've been together for years. Obviously, there's such a high divorce rate. Like, what do you do to make them feel comfortable and then kind of rewire, I guess, their relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it is a thing, maybe not 7 years, but around that time, between I would say like 5 and 10-ish, it gets pretty tricky. And again, I feel like, I'm kind of like a broken record. I say it all the time, but when you can be vulnerable, again, that's something that doesn't come naturally for people. Most people don't go into a relationship just kind of being completely vulnerable all the time. And so I'll have clients that, not even just at that stage, but I'll have people that, have been together 25 years and they just start that vulnerability piece. They just learn how to do that, and it completely like refreshes your entire relationship. It starts, it's like they've got a whole new partner. They know them on such a different level, and that can be maintained. So it's not just like that honeymoon period, right, where it's like a short time and then it kind of dissipates when real life kicks in. If you keep up with the vulnerability, you can keep that close connection. And so you can kind of, I tell people it's even better than the honeymoon period because it's so genuine, right? And it's just, you can maintain it as long as you're willing to maintain that work.
And that's the thing, it's maintaining the work, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you find some couples are like, what, we've then got to like, we can't just rely on you, like codependencies, or let's just go back to Kayla, she'll help us. Like, how do you kind of set that that boundary with them? Because that probably can happen quite often, I can imagine.
Yeah, I really focus on, I say the same thing. You guys don't want to be coming to me forever,
Oh my.
and so we don't focus on every little conflict. That's not going to, then they will be coming to me forever, so if we can like get down to like the deeper meaning of a conflict, right? Like if I am angry that my husband didn't come didn't call before he comes home late. Maybe if I go down a little deeper, maybe I'm feeling rejected or disappointed, right? And so that's where that anger is masking the vulnerability. And so if I can teach the clients to get down to that deeper meaning and communicate that, then that there's really something to work with, right? Once you can get to the vulnerable piece, because if you just say, I'm mad to your partner, that doesn't really connect you, right? But if you say, I'm hurting right now, that does most of the time. And so again, that vulnerability, it pulls them in and it kind of aligns you guys as a team to like, let's figure this out. We don't want you to be feeling this pain. And so if I can equip them with that, they can kind of learn that. And that stuff kind of all goes back to earlier, usually childhood or earlier traumas. And so also doing that exploration, like, where's this coming from? Where are these, beliefs, where did they originate from? And doing that kind of work in a session. So both the client can understand it and their partner can like watch and see where that's coming from. That'll develop that empathy and they're more willing to work together. Oh, I don't want you to be, triggered as, and we'll be able to figure out what that was, the trigger is from. And so, like I said, that can really evoke the empathy from the other partner. And so they're more willing to work as a team. But yeah, if you stay just on the surface of each fight, you're not going to get anywhere,
They're going to be in your office like from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then what tips would you share for anyone around like how to deepen their communication if they're used to like they're just past the honeymoon phase, things aren't feeling great? What can they do to kind of like get more comfortable with open communication?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just being really specific as to like what they're feeling. Again, it kind of sounds cheesy, but if I tell them go on Google, just Google a feelings list and look it up, right? Instead of saying I'm mad right now, like look through all the things, maybe you are feeling disappointed, like I said earlier, disappointed, and whatever that is, that's how you can communicate with your partner. Because again, the anger, that'll just push them away. That's not connecting. And so when you can really get specific and help your partner understand, that can make a difference. And then your partner needs to validate. And so the thing with validation, I always tell people you can validate and not agree, and people really get stuck on that. And so the way you do that is because they'll say, how can I validate? I wouldn't feel, disappointed if she didn't call me if she was running late. And so I always tell them to just focus on the feeling and not the why. So you focus on feeling, what would it be like for you to feel disappointed? Not because they didn't call, just focus on what would it be like if you felt disappointed, or what would it feel like if you were afraid your partner was going to leave you, or whatever it is. And then they can validate that, and then their partner will feel heard, and that'll soften them up enough to kind of engage and work together.
So how do they start that? Do you see what I mean? Like that is the first step's always the biggest, right? And the hardest to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think being able to recognize, right? Am I going to anger? Like, is that what it is? Because I would say like 95% of the time if clients will come in, they'll say, I'm just so mad, I'm so angry. That's kind of like a red flag for me. I'll go, okay, wait. Or and anger can be irritable, frustrated, annoyed. Those are all forms of anger. And so when they do that, I'll say, put that put that frustration into words. And once they do that, so, well, I just really wanted to have dinner with them and we didn't. And so I'd say that sounds more like disappointment to me. And so when you do that, you can get kind of an idea, I think, of what that is, that deeper, more vulnerable feeling.
And do you think, like, it's crazy, and I don't mean this in like a shameful way, but it's really surprising that a lot of us don't know how to name our feelings and emotions, and yet we've had them our whole lives. Like, that's part of who we are. Like, why do you think that is?
Again, I think it's just because it is so scary to be vulnerable, right? It's scary to give people this opportunity to hurt you. That's, you're giving them a lot of very personal information. And I think all of us at some point have had that used against us, in our lives. And what is that going to naturally do, right? Oh, I don't want to do that again. And so in addition to that, the generations before us, this wasn't normal, especially for males, but females too, I wasn't raised to talk about our feelings, I was raised to like, shut up if you feel, if you're crying, I'll give you something to cry about is what I used to hear, and so I wasn't able to, really have those emotions and express them. So again, why I went through so many years of therapy to learn how to do that.
Wow, I guess like it's a huge movement, and I wonder what the next generation is going to look like. So like the families that you're working with now, that you're going to have a ripple effect in a positive way on like their children and their children's children. Do you ever think and imagine like what kind of the next generations are going to be like, with relationship challenges? Maybe they won't have many. They probably will, but they'll be new.
Yeah, I think they'll be there, but hopefully they'll be better equipped to kind of deal with them. Hopefully it'll be modeled better than it was for us, even more so for our right. It was just, the further we go back, the more difficult it was. I don't think it was any fault of my parents or anyone's parents that they didn't know how to foster that vulnerability. But the more mental health is kind of understood, I think, in our society, the better, of course, right? It's not so embarrassing or shameful to go to a therapist, hopefully. And we can just talk to our kids like, I'm not a parenting expert by any means, but to talk to our kids and kind of honor that feeling. Oh, I see that looks like it really hurt your feelings right now, and kind of talking to them about that instead of, oh, don't worry about it, like that's fine. So really respecting that, and then just like I said, modeling it, being vulnerable, showing our kids that we're human too. Hard things happen, and we don't have to be like, so stoic and have such a brave face, because things hurt. They hurt our feelings, and showing our kids that that's okay. We don't have to, no one's, perfect. No one is, immune to getting their feelings hurt or feeling, difficult emotions. I think that does make such a difference, and it does definitely give me hope. And I see it a lot with just, I have a 7 and 4-year-old, and just with hanging out with their, my friends, their moms, their friends' moms and everything. It's just a new way to operate in this day and age, fortunately.
Yeah, and there's going to be, I can imagine, a whole new realm of like issues that we just don't know about, that we're potentially creating, and like, I don't know, in other ways, and be like, well, mom and dad used to have problems talking about their feelings, and the kids would be like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a great thing. So,
yeah.
What say there's like a couple, there's a lot of couples listening that are thinking, I really need some support. Like, what would you suggest? How would you suggest they bring it up in a conversation with their other partner of like, hey, I think we should go see a therapist? Because that's also another big thing to have to admit if one of you's feeling like it and the other one just, I don't know, is just not aware or doesn't want to, I guess.
Yeah, and I get people saying this a lot. Actually, I was just talking to someone, and they said, I didn't want to bring it up to my partner because I was, I was worried what they would think, and they've been together 2 years. And I said, well, how long ago was that? And she said, a year and a half ago. And so it had gone all this time, and so again, it's really vulnerable to say that, right? I think we need some help. So it's just practice and getting uncomfortable. I know that's, kind of a cliche to say, but it is just because that's the first step. You're going to be doing a lot more of that if you are able to save your relationship, which a lot of times it can be saved, right? But if you're going to do the work, it's going to be uncomfortable. So you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah. And I guess like bringing up the feeling of uncomfortability is the worst part in itself. Cause like I said, you've just got to get used to it. So it's almost like ripping the Band-Aid off, as it were,
Right.
and being like, okay. Yeah. And I guess if it depends on how the other partner responds. If they're like a no, I guess that's another option of, well, what are we doing? Like, yeah. And then for you, I guess, like, where do you see yourself going, like, with what you're doing and who you're helping? Like, do you have any like aspirations of like other fields you want to go into or other areas?
Yeah, I think I just want to just continue to like grow in the couples therapy field. And I like I said, I also specialize in trauma, and so I like to incorporate the two, and just kind of building that, because everyone experiences trauma. Everyone is, people sometimes think trauma is only being in combat or a violent assault or something, but there's other, everything, or not everything, but there's a lot of things. Those are what we call big T traumas, but then there's also little T traumas, a really bad fight with our partner, or there can be so many things, and there can be traumas outside of the relationship, and those will impact your relationship. And then there'll be some that are inside the relationship. Like I said, like a difficult fight or infidelity, or even just a uncomfortable experience. And so kind of continuing on that, kind of really combining the two and incorporating the trauma work into the couples work. I think I want to just keep going on to that. It's been so beneficial so far. And so I want to just keep building on that, I think.
Amazing. And then like obviously combining trauma and the relationship piece, like do you find that comes up naturally in conversation when you have your clients, or that's something that kind of unfolds later on through the discussions? Because some people can realize they're not traumatized when they're traumatized, I guess, as well, and you have to maybe highlight that to them as well.
Yeah, that happens a lot, right? They'll say, oh wait, no, people think of the word trauma and they're like, it's such like a big word, and they're like, oh wait, no way, but like I said, a lot of things do go back to childhood. And so once we get to the deeper meaning of those fights, like I was saying earlier, right, not staying on the surface, that's gonna, what you kind of pull from the fight will be related to some usually childhood trauma, if not just it could be just a big earlier trauma, but more likely than not childhood trauma. And so we identify that pretty quickly. And that is, what I was talking about when I'll do what we call inner child work, and we'll kind of explore where that came from. And I like doing that in the presence of their partner. A lot of modalities do those separate. They separate trauma and couples therapy. But doing it in the presence of your partner, again, it just evokes that empathy in them. I've heard people say, oh, I I thought what they were asking me to do was just not like something so silly. It didn't matter to me. But now I know, when I don't text them back right away, that's, triggering them from their abandonment trauma when their dad left when they were, 3 years old. Then now that I know, then I'll do that, right? Like they're a lot more willing to meet their partner's needs when they can understand it a little bit better.
Because that's scary, doing inner child work in front of your partner. That I'm very all in for this, but I'm like, that scares me. Yeah. Particularly, I can imagine that there's sometimes you think that you uncover things that the person didn't realize was inner child stuff,
Yeah, more often than not, I would say almost all the time, you uncover stuff because we grow up with this, right? We don't realize that it impacted us. This is just how we grew up. This is just life, and so when an outsider can kind of see that and put it together, it can really and reflect it back. It can be, oh wow, I had no idea that would have had such an impact on me. And sometimes, if a client will really get stuck, I'll say, well, if your, daughter had this exact experience growing up, because they'll sometimes say, oh, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that big of a deal. It couldn't have had an impact on me. And I'll say, what would it be like if you had a child and they had that same experience? And that'll kind of like, oh, wow. And then that'll kind of, reflect, I guess, I wouldn't want another child to experience that because that would be really hard. That can help clients see things a little bit removed and have more empathy, because we don't have as much empathy for ourselves, right?
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
I think it's just because that's all we've known growing up, and for us, this is just normal. This is just how life is, and it takes someone who hasn't been in that to say, oh, wait, like that's not how, that's not right. That's not fair that you had to go through that. And again, like, you'll say, well, I was fine. It didn't impact me that much.
Yeah, like I was fine, don't worry about it. And you're like, well, we're in the therapy room right now.
Exactly.
So
yeah. So yeah, exactly.
yeah. And I guess like it's fascinating what's going on in everyone's brains is just totally different and no one knows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We all think we're running on the same thing, like you said, but we're running on totally different wires.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's every single person has a different perspective of things, and I think that is a big source of conflict in couples. They just kind of think this is just how it goes, and it's not always that way. I always tell couples when they come in, and I'll say, how did your parents fight? What was that like? And if they say, oh, they didn't fight, that's a red flag, because then because every couple fights, and
they
so
have to, surely, like, come on.
but some parents keep it from their kids, and it's not healthy to scream and shout and have scary conflict in front of your kids, but to be able to model healthy conflict and repair, it's very important, because if a client doesn't see that, then they go into a relationship and they have a small argument and they go, oh my God, does this mean our relationship's over? Right. And they don't know how to handle that. Right. Maybe they'll shut down or wall off, or they'll whatever it is, so. And conversely, right, watching your parents have big blow up fights can kind of do the opposite, so that's why, it's so important to do couples therapy, or to, in some way learn how to have healthy conflict and repair, and model that if you have children, because they need to learn how to, how do we uh, live in a healthy relationship going forward.
Totally. And I think that's such a good point you raised around not seeing parents argue, because I think like in that generation, it was seen as a taboo to show, to show your children that you're having issues and not share that mom and dad aren't happy with something right now, and to shut that. But even as children, and I'm reflecting on my childhood, you know when mom and dad aren't great. Like you know. So there's
Right.
no point in hiding it, because as a kid you can feel that energy, you know something's off.
Yeah. And just as human beings, we make meaning of things. That's how we operate, and oftentimes the meaning that we're making is worse than the real reality. And so when a child just senses that tension and they can't make sense of it, they're probably thinking things worse than reality.
And it's them as well. It's often thinking that it's their fault rather
Right.
than anything
Yeah,
to do with mom and
exactly.
dad. Yes. Oh, this is so good. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, this is so fun. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. If anyone's listening and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I need Kayla in my life," where's the best way to find you? And I'll put it obviously all in the show notes for everyone as well.
Great. Yeah. You can find me on my website. It's just southdenvertherapy.com. And I offer in-person sessions in Denver, Colorado. And then I offer either virtual couples therapy or couples coaching, kind of anywhere.
And what's the difference between couples therapy and couples coaching?
So couples coaching, you're going to give more of the tools, and you're not going to be doing like the trauma work. To be able to do like the heavy trauma stuff, that's going to be therapy. Coaching is just kind of guiding them. How can you communicate better? How can you show the vulnerability? But to do that really deep work, that's going to be therapy.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And yeah, thank you so much. And I'll put everything in the show notes for everyone if they want to reach out to Kayla, or obviously you have my details. If there's anything else you want to talk about. And thank you so much for listening today. And once again, thank you so much for joining me, Kayla. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lucy. It's been great.
You're welcome.